The world is in a climate crisis, and all industries must do their part to reach zero emissions. Maritime trade is critical to today's society, but is also responsible for 2.8% of all greenhouse gases. A future where global trade reaches zero is possible, but how do we actually get there? I'm Lora Jacobson, Zero North's Chief Purpose Activist and an expert in sustainable shipping. In Navigating Zero, I'm sitting down with thought leaders to explore the inner workings of global trade, its massive impact on our society, and the obstacles it faces in navigating its way to zero. Just like other sectors within the global trade industry, shipbuilding is affected by wider geopolitical context, trends, and regulations. Some of the trends posing significant challenges today are the conflict in Ukraine, competition from Asia, digitalization, and the maritime talent gap. My guest today is going to dig a little deeper into these trends. But despite these challenges, ship manufacturers have an opportunity to lead the way in the green transition as they design and build the next generation of technologically advanced ships. Today's guest is Christophe Tytgat, Secretary General of Sea Europe and CISA. Christophe is a lawyer by training, and his work revolves around defending the interests of shipyards and maritime equipment manufacturers. He is a driving force in shaping policies and advocating for the advancement of the maritime industry on both regional and international platforms. I'd like to start our conversation off today by having Christophe expand on the wider trends that are affecting the shipbuilding community.
It's clear that the green transition, so sustainability and climate neutrality, are certainly very high on the agenda, on the political agenda, especially in Europe, but also on the agenda of the companies and our member associations. But let's say the green transition can be seen in itself as an important challenge, but also seen from the perspective of shipyards and equipment manufacturers as a very interesting opportunity. But in terms of trends, there is much more than just the green transition. First and foremost, there is a big competition battle between Europe and Asia. And this is already taking place for about 4 decades, where, let's say, the center of gravity moved from Europe away to Asia, Japan, South Korea, and nowadays China. And this is, let's say, not new, but what is new is that this entire competition pressure has to be seen now in days of lessons to be learned from the pandemic. So the big dependence we have from countries like China, for instance, but also needs to be looked at in the context of the war in Ukraine and increased geopolitical tension. So it's not just a competition between sectors or in between companies. It's, let's say, a competition that has to be seen in a much wider scale. And there the green transition plays also a very important role. It's almost who will be the champion in green in the next, let's say, 25 to 30 years. But also the digitalization is playing a very important role. I know it's a very large concept. So it's digitalization, automation, autonomy that you see at the level of companies. So for instance, in the ship production, but also at the level of the products, so the ships in all its aspects. But then, and this should not be underestimated, I would say the fight for talents, the fight for skills. And this is not something that is purely limited to Europe. We have regular meetings with our Asian competitors where it has become clear that also for them, finding the right people, maintaining the right people, or attracting people to the sector, to the shipbuilding industry, is not a walk in the park, because youngsters have a tendency to look at shipbuilding and equipment manufacturing as a relatively old-fashioned industry, even though that is not necessarily the case anymore. And they are much more, let's say, attracted by other industries. So all these aspects, competition, green and digital transition, and the fight or the competition for skills are all important trends that we have seen in the past years and that we will certainly see in the coming years and decades.
I understand the geopolitical situation weighs heavily on this industry. And it's interesting that you say that it's an industry where it's hard to get talents. And that's being one of the issues that's affecting the green transition, because the industry is transforming so dramatically fast. And with digitalization coming in, certainly technology on ships is also something that needs to drive forward. So are there other elements that, are being affected in this green transition that you can talk about?
The green transition is a challenge that has a lot of elements or components. But bottom line is, if we want to make the industry in a way that in future its impact on climate, on the environment reduces, there's an awful lot of aspects that need to be tackled. If you start from the product and the way it is manufactured, first of all, the way that ships are produced will be changed. Also, the ship production and the equipment production needs to be done in a way that is greener, more sustainable, and climate neutral. And that comes at a cost, of course. And for that, you also need to find the right people. But then if you look at the products, the ships as such, also there is a lot that needs to be done, starting from the design of the ships. The energy efficiency of the ships need to be improved. Technologies need to be put on board. And then we are talking about existing technologies, almost mature technologies, new technologies that are under development or that perhaps have not yet been developed to tackle the fuels of the ships. Then we are talking about fossil fuels, what we have today, but also about the alternative fuels, the fuels of the future. And there you have then the question mark, what will be the winners in future? Will there be sufficient quantities available? Where will they be available? What about the infrastructure in the ports? And with the fossil fuels, do we strike them out completely, or do we produce or use technologies that can basically minimize or reduce the negative impacts of fossil fuel whilst continuing to use that type of fuel? And then the last point, at what cost will this all come? Because one thing is for sure, nobody knows the real cost price, but everybody knows that going from where we are today to, let's say, the future, which will be green, sustainable, and climate neutral, will come at a cost, and the cost will be much higher than what we know today. And who is going to finance all that, and where to find the money? All these aspects are part of the same header, green transition.
Do you think that the industry is leaning on policy to help them make the tough choices and transition, or is the industry really leading things forward?
It's not that industry is waiting alone for policy or vice versa. I think at the end, this entire transition can only work if there is, I would say, a perfect marriage between industry on the one hand and politics on the other hand. It's obvious that politics have a certain level of ambition that the industry needs to fulfill. And let's say the perception in the industry of what the political ambitions are can be varying depending on the stakeholder that we are talking about. But on the other hand, the industry is also capable of doing certain things if there is a certain framework for it, if there is a certain support for it. So there we need the policymakers. So in the end, the best way we could move forward is if we sit together and try to find the best possible way forward. Clearly, everybody has a 100% wish list, and in the reality, it will not fulfillment of the 100% wish list. But we need to find a way that everybody is on board and that it can work. And for that, you need all the parties around the table.
And there's a lot happening within regulations today. I mean, certainly within the IMO and the MPC 81, which just wrapped up. It's interesting to look at what the policymakers are trying to do, but also how does that affect the work you do in, for example, this Sea Europe and the other associations?
The entire green agenda has certainly put a lot of pressure on all of us because it's so high on the agenda for obvious reasons. It's high on the agenda in a European context as well as in an IMO context. And we are active in the two instances at the same time. So there's a lot of attention, a lot of resources, and a lot of time that goes to that. And we need to be there because, as I said, ultimately, what we want as any other stakeholder is a final outcome of legislation or policy initiatives that is as close as possible to the interests that we have and to what we can realize.
You talk about how collaboration is kind of key for working together with the policies. But I wonder, even if it's making your work harder or the industry's work harder, it's something that we all have to do.
Yeah, correct.
In the latter half of the 20th century, the maritime industry began to roll out joint industry projects as a way of navigating an environment of increasing technological complexity. These days, we see a multitude of these projects every year, in which a variety of stakeholders forge relationships and explore new ways of pushing industries forward. Last year, for example, Equinor, Shell, Total, and Gasco launched a joint industry project to design new ships that may enable carbon capture at scale. As we move into a future where policy and regulation increasingly set goals for the green transition, it'll be interesting to see what kind of innovations partnerships like these might achieve. In early 2024, the European Commission published a long-awaited report which mapped out the transition pathways for its mobility ecosystem. Christophe and Sea Europe were heavily involved in influencing its direction. And I'd like him to tell us a little bit more about what its findings were and what their implications could be.
That report published earlier this year is in fact the reflection of a process that started in January 2022 and that has taken more or less 2 years. Why was this initiative taken from the start? When this European Commission, started its mandate in 2019, there was a political choice to concentrate the political attention on 14 so-called strategic industrial ecosystems. All these 14 have been identified, and one of the 14 is the mobility ecosystem. Now, in the mobility ecosystem, you have, in fact, 4 stakeholders. You have the maritime industry, you have the automotive industry, you have the biking industry, and you have the railway industry. Why were these 4 taken together? The idea was that we all have the same challenges in terms of innovation, in terms of digitalization, in terms of competitiveness, in terms of the green transition, in terms of finding the right people. And so for 2 years, we have gone through an entire process based on commission documents, based on a series of thematic workshops where all the stakeholders from these various industries were sitting together with the policymakers in the European Commission in order to identify what they call pathways to transit the mobility ecosystem from where it was in 2022, learning lessons from the pandemic, because that is actually the background of it, to get to an industry that is more resilient, more competitive, more innovative, green and digital, and able to find all the skills. The report we have seen in January this year is a very interesting one because whilst initially the entire exercise was based on what they called finding synergies between all the stakeholders in the mobility system, we have come to the conclusion, all of us, and now also the European Commission, that at first sight, we have indeed the same challenges in terms of innovation, green, digital, and so on. But when you peel the onion, then you start to realize that the header innovation or the header green has a different context and a different content and a different type of challenge for bikes than for railway, than for maritime. Now, the report we have seen, or the report that was published in the beginning of this year, seen from our perspective as Europe and as maritime industry, is actually a very positive one. Why am I saying this? The original exercise that started in 2022 did not really mention the big challenges that the maritime industry, let alone the shipbuilding industry in Europe, were facing. One of our biggest challenges, the competitiveness challenge with Asia, was not even mentioned. Now, the report has all these challenges spelled out and recognized, and even foreseen from a specific set of proposed actions. The question will now be, this entire exercise that has taken place over the past 2 years, how is it going to be further developed? Clearly, there is the intention of the European Commission to continue this exercise under the next European Commission, but we will see whether that is going to be the case. From our perspective as Sea Europe, the report offers a lot of munition, a lot of hooks that we use in the context of what we are developing as we speak, and that is the content of what we call a maritime industrial strategy, being a very specific, sector-specific strategy that should boost the shipyards and equipment manufacturers in terms of competition, green transition, digital transition.
I'm curious to know, you said at the beginning that the intricacies of shipbuilding and of the maritime industry wasn't part of this published report that the European Commission had put together. And then now the most recent one was way more specific and detailed. And I'm wondering, how that happened.
What has certainly helped has been the changed political context. In 2022, we had, of course, the pandemic, but not all the lessons from the pandemic had been learned. But what was certainly even more important than the pandemic crisis has been the war in Ukraine, which has put the traditional political thinking in Brussels, I would say, upside down. From a more liberal approach with open markets and open trades, no protectionism or as little as possible, we have now come to a situation whereby different sectors are looked at on their own merits, specificities, and strategic importance. If you translate that to the maritime industry and you look at shipbuilding specifically, we were strategic and we are still considered, shipbuilding is still considered strategic in Asia. But in Europe, since, let's say, the beginning or the early 2000s, shipbuilding was not perceived as strategic anymore. The state aid framework that we had at the time was even abolished. It was not abolished elsewhere in the world. Since the early 2000s, shipbuilding was treated in Europe as any other sector. And there is a term for that in the European context. It's called horizontal policies. So basically, the policies that apply to our sector are the same that apply to any other sector, regardless of what a specific sector needs in terms of measures, in terms of challenges, or has in terms of challenges. And with the war in Ukraine, the concept of strategic autonomy was introduced. And in fact, the entire concept is very simple. It is the question, to what extent do we continue with the more, I would say, liberalistic business as usual, or where do we go for a more strategic approach? And that also means no longer the one-size-fits-all policies across the board for any sector or any industry, but more a tailor-made sectoral approach. And this is certainly something that we are now facing. Before 2022, the politicians knew our problems, but were not really keen on dealing with them or recognizing them fully, certainly not in official documents. Now, they have understood, if you want to protect your trade, if you want to win the green transition, you also need to look at what is your, let's say, cargo, that are ships. So therefore, you also need an industry that can build these ships, that can maintain these ships. So the strategic dimension of our sector is again fully recognized. And so this was not the case a couple of years ago.
In an industry as complex as ours, a one-size-fits-all approach to regulations just doesn't seem to work anymore. That's why it's so important that we have industry experts like Christophe sharing their knowledge with regulators and policymakers. This expertise helps regulators sculpt the right frameworks and policies to drive real change, while also protecting specific interests of a sector, in this case, shipbuilding. When the report's findings were published, Christophe commented that, quote, "The first important steps towards a maritime industrial strategy have been taken." However, he also stressed that the next critical step was a setup of a discussion forum that could bring together all key maritime stakeholders. Only then could Europe begin its journey to autonomy and economic resilience in earnest. Ursula von der Leyen's European Green Deal was another set of policies that laid out some initial plans for a European green transition.
The maritime sector was also very much at the heart of the European Green Deal, with very specific measures like the inclusion of shipping into the EU emission trading scheme. And so basically how to make sure that the polluter pays and that the highest polluters are, let's say, transiting as fast as possible to become better or less polluting operators. There was also the initiative on the so-called Fuel EU maritime legislation that was, let's say, intended to take away the barriers for the transition from fossil fuel towards alternative sustainable fuels. All these type of initiatives have been monitored, analyzed, discussed, and commented upon by, let's say, stakeholders like Sea Europe. We have offered our experience, our recommendations, our ideas. But of course, now it has all become legislation. To an extent, the polluters will have to pay to an extent, but there is also a lot more that needs to be done. And so all these initiatives, of course, have now an impact on shipyards and equipment manufacturers in the sense that we know that the climate neutral approach is the target for the next 25 to 30 years. That means that we will need to build ships that are cleaner, greener, more sustainable and climate neutral, that we will need to retrofit existing vessels into green, cleaner, sustainable and more climate neutral vessels, and that we will have to produce all the type of technologies and systems that will allow for a more sustainable and climate neutral industry. So that is a fact. The question now is, with the initiatives that have been taken in the context of the Green Deal, is that enough or do we need more? And we believe that the European Green Deal was only the first step, but that much more needs to be done in terms of really creating the business case and in terms of creating framework conditions that will help the business case, that will help the uptake. So the European Green Deal was certainly a very important first step, which we welcomed and we fully supported, but much more needs to be done.
So it seems to me that this strategic autonomy is something that's critical for Europe right now. And I'm glad that it's actually moved things forward a little bit for the shipbuilding community or sector. But with the political climate that we have today, this podcast is also about how do we educate the audience on the details so that they can also help move things forward. So I'd like to delve a little bit into the details. You've talked about the three biggest challenges today. One is competition from Asia, one is the European Green Deal, and digitalization and automation. So if we can delve a little bit deeper into competition from Asia, what is it, what needs to be done, and how do we solve the problem?
What is it? The fact of life is that the shipyards and the local supply chain in Asia, since it is seen as strategic, benefits from a wide range of measures like state aid, favorable financial incentives, or put it differently, easier access to finance, and certain trade protectionist measures, which we don't apply in Europe. So if you want to have, let's say, fairer competition, then something needs to be changed. And that means either the Asians have to change their policies, which they will not do. So then Europe needs to decide whether it will, I would say, follow the Asian example, or another possibility is that all the parties come together at international level and find an internationally agreed solution, something that has already been tested a couple of times, but so far without any success. For us, that means that the European Union and the European Commission in the first place, certainly under the next mandate, needs to take or to put in place framework conditions that will help us to do two things. Point one, to help us in maintaining the global leadership position that we have today in what we call complex shipbuilding, so like cruise vessels, for instance, but at the same time also make sure that we can regain certain ship types that are strategic for the European economy and then put measures in place that help us regaining these ship types. Like, for instance, short sea shipping, not to name that one. What that means in terms of concrete content remains to be seen. There is, of course, an important political and international legal dimension, which makes the situation a bit more complex to find an easy solution. But in terms of creating easier access to public funding, easier access to commercial money in order to support the investments of the industry for the green and the digital transition will certainly help. And then, of course, I think the EU also needs to reflect on its own standards. The EU has very high standards when it comes to social issues, when it comes to green issues. At the same time, we import or we use a lot of products that are built outside the EU that do not necessarily meet these standards. Are we going to continue to do that or to allow that? Or are we going to become much more stricter on saying, okay, what trades in Europe should be at European standards? I think these are the things that we need to look into.
Thank you for your insight on that. I'd like to begin to wrap up our conversation with a short discussion on the digitalization challenge that touches every corner of our industry. So what exciting developments are you seeing in the context of shipbuilding?
I think the digitalization and the automation will help the green transition, but not only. It will help the green transition because it will help through sensors, through better communication, ship to shore, to monitor, I would say, the environmental performance of a ship, which is already to an extent the case today, but it will only improve. It will also make, let's say, the operation of the ship and its positioning towards ports most likely easier, so that, let's say, the fuel consumption can be reduced, so that, let's say, better planning can be done, so that not too much time is wasted, and thereby not fuel, energy, and all that are mastered in or managed in a much better way. So the digitalization will certainly help in the green transition. But I think the digitalization and the automation goes far beyond the green transition alone. It will certainly improve the communication between ships and between the ship and the shore. It will certainly help also to increase maritime safety. It will also help the seafarers to take away certain pressure or certain tasks that they have to do today, giving them more time to focus on other tasks, or to give them more time to focus on more important tasks. So there is a wide variety, I think, of applications or benefits that you will have from the digitalization and the automation. Everybody, of course, talks about, I would say, the cherry on the pie, and that is the autonomous vessel, which is also becoming a reality. But I think on the high seas, let's put it like that, that is not yet, I think, for the foreseeable future. But there are certainly other applications that can already do a great deal of benefits also for the green transition.
So many things coming up in shipbuilding as far as digitalization, automation, but none of that will matter if we don't have bold leaders who will carry the green transition forward in shipbuilding. So if we were just going to wrap up, what is your hope for the shipbuilding industry and the larger global trade industry that leaders can do?
I think the hope in Europe is twofold. Making sure that we can continue to build vessels and to take care of vessels as we have done for so many years. Certainly on the ship types we take care of today, and perhaps also on other ship types, certain ship segments that we have lost. That is a very important starting point. So in other words, we need to become again competitive also beyond the markets that we do today. And why? This is not just a commercial, or I would say partly an existential need, but it will also help us to deliver on the green ship of the future in accordance with the European or the IMO legislation. We have built up a lot of knowledge over the years in integrating the technologies, because European shipyards are, let's say, not just building ships, but they are even more integrators of technologies and systems. These technologies and systems, including the ones for the green transition, are produced still predominantly by European companies. We need to be able to do that. We have made it very clear we want to be on top of the game in Europe. We want to build these ships. We want to build this equipment. We were, perhaps contrary to many other stakeholders, we were from the very beginning in full support of policies like the European Green Deal. We just need to have the framework conditions in place to fulfill that, I would say, duty, political duty, but also that commercial wish. And that is what I hope for, and what the industry leaders hope for, that they will be able to do in the next, 10 to 25 or 30 years.
Shipbuilding and the green transition are strongly linked. There is a changing of the tide in Europe, with new policies and regulations that are putting more pressure on stakeholders to build vessels with new fuel and design capabilities. Ships are, after all, a perfect testing ground for new technologies that may further enable the green transition. I found my conversation with Christophe incredibly enlightening. There were a few points I'd like to highlight before we close out. Christophe said the green transition can only be achieved by marrying policy and stakeholder willingness. The two must go hand in hand to drive the industry forward. He also mentioned that member organizations like Sea Europe have the power to impact real change. This tells us something interesting about the influence that larger discussion forums and other partnerships might have. And lastly, the European Green Deal and policies like it are an important first step, but more must be done to make sure that we hit the targets that they set out. Thank you so much to Christophe Tytgat for joining me today. And thank you for listening to the 10th episode of Navigating Zero, Global Trade's Powerful Wave of Change. If this conversation has inspired you, please follow us on your podcast app of choice for more fascinating discussions on how we reach zero emissions. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find a link in the show notes. This is the end of Season 1 of Navigating Zero, Global Trade's Powerful Wave of Change. In Season 1, we set out to have in-depth conversations with experts on how we reach zero emissions across our complex and diverse industry. Our guests shared perspectives from a variety of places, from ports, shipbuilding, and ship ownership, all the way to those who are practicing bold leadership, generational thinking, and change management. We also spoke to guests who sit at the forefront of technological change in data sharing, AI, the energy transition, and shaping the green fuel future. We're going to be taking a short break while we record our second season. The new season will bring fresh perspectives from more exciting guests on how we navigate our way to zero. We're looking forward to sharing it with you soon. Bye for now.